for this reason, straight boards are generally going to be just heavier than non-straight boards. And just as an example here, if we run a range of flops from ace, king, queen to 4, 3 deuce, rainbow, or whatever, at 35% range will flop the nuts around 10% of the time. Well, it will only flop the nuts around 3% of the time on ace, queen 9, ace, king 9 through 7, 6 deuce, which are boards where the nuts is top set, obviously. So basically there are just way more combos of, you know, a two card combo is just gonna be more frequent than one specific pair combo, especially when there's a blocker to that pair on the board, such as on these boards. So what does this mean? It means well, the fact that it's heavier, you're obviously gonna get less folds and there's gonna be more action. Having a higher frequency of the nuts in our range is gonna allow us to bluff more frequently as well. So dynamic tends to get pretty aggressive and it becomes crucial to fight back. And so let's go ahead and take a look at our first straights. These are just the ace high Broadway boards that just have one nut straight, and basically all non-nut straight draws and whatnot are kind of worthless pretty often. These boards are pretty heavy in sets and the nut straight, and continuing ranges on these flops, especially in the rainbow versions, is obviously just basically always gonna be just like two pair or a set or the nut straight, and there's just not gonna be much else to worry about. On straight boards, like I said on the last slide, we're gonna need hands that do well against straights, and that's, you know, sets fill that role pretty well. On all of these boards where you're often gonna flop a set, you should know you know, you can use them both as bluff catchers or value bets, depending obviously in the exact situation you're in, just very opponent and situation dependent. So there's this new update on Pro Poker Tools where they included the interactive flop hand stats, which is a pretty awesome tool. Where you can basically filter through all of these stats and you'll get the results here of how often they have it. So the basic breakdown is by hand category. And you can see here, you know, 25% of the time a 35% range is gonna flop a set or a straight. Obviously there's only one straight possible, so it's always the nut straight. And then almost, you know, 40% of the time he's still gonna flop top pair and two pair. And then I filtered the top pair and two pair hands, and then see how many of them had gutters, because I think that's a pretty important distinction on this type of board textures. And here we have the information that top pair and two pair hands will have an additional gutter, you know, almost half the time. So total 20% of the time they're gonna have, you know, top pair and two pair with a gutter, which is a pretty decently strong hand. No one's ever gonna fold that to, you know, a single C bet or maybe even two, especially the two pairs. And then, you know, 25% of the time, as I said, a set or straight. So it's pretty often people are gonna be hitting this board pretty hard, and so that means, you know, even with bottom set here, you shouldn't be really that happy, and it's probably a fold if people are trying to put in money in the pot, unless like the SPR is obviously pretty low. So another thing that's particular to this board that I thought of is blockers. On ace king jack, for example, 35% range is gonna be playing, you know, queen queen and 10-10 pretty often pre-flop. So I ran some simulations and found out that someone will have queen queen on 10-10 without the nut straight around 10% of the time, which is pretty often, almost as often as having the nut straight or a set. So this was pretty an interesting find, I guess, and I think people instinctively kind of get to understand this after a while, because I think lately people have been calling down on this type of boards with 2 pairs and set type of hands whenever someone's trying to rep the straight. And it is actually pretty often that you see someone turning queens into a bluff here for multiple streets. And the last thing I want to say about blockers is, just for curiosity's sakes, having queen queen or 10 here or 10 here reduces the frequency of the nut straight from this 12.4% to around 7%, which is actually not that low. It's still like a much higher, well, it's still a higher percentage than top set. Um, Maybe not top set. Yeah, should be. Um, anyway, semi bluffs on these Ace Broadway straight type boards. When the SPR is low, they're usually done with just like can be with just like a top pair and a gutter, or any set, obviously. And when on higher SPRs situations, I find that's often not the case, and people usually are pretty just happy to just call down. And so the hands that people do bluff raise with in higher SPR spots tend to be more like blockers, which makes sense because on low SPR scenarios you can't really use blockers because there's just not enough fold equity because people are stacking off lighter. So let's move on to straights without an ace in them, but still high or medium. There's still a pretty high frequency of sets, especially on king and queen high boards. And the thing that's different about these boards is that now there's not straights available. Again, these hands are pretty opponent dependent, situation dependent, and we'll be able to see more of them in the hand histories. Just in general, obviously they're worth at least usually 1 or 2 streets of value or of calling. Can really fold not straight just for 1 bet in most situations, although there are certainly some you should be able to. And then in other situations, the second nut straight is obviously the nuts, because the nut straight is heavily discounted when an opponent takes a line that's just a very passive line most of the time. You can treat as the second nut straight as the nuts. So another difference is on boards like king, queen 9, there's only a couple of gutters that can come to put higher straights out there, while on Jack 10-7, that's the same basic structure. There's obviously a lot of more overcards, and the king queen and ace king queen combos are gonna be much more likely, or the queen 9 also. So let's talk a little bit about different type of structures within this type of straights. Obviously, the first structure we have the king queen jack, which is still it should probably be in the last slide. There's just kind of a Broadway, and they do have a non-nut straight, but it's such a heavy board that the non-nut straight is actually pretty weak on this board specifically. So yeah, on this board you don't really want to be holding 9-10 or bottom set either, and you feel pretty much better, I guess, with just like kings, and you'd much rather have top set than 9-10. Because you obviously have some equity against the nuts, while with 9-10 you're drawing dead. So again, the breakdown of hand categories is going to be pretty low in air, and you can see here on Jack 10-7 and Jack 8-7. The main difference between these boards is just that on Jack 10-7 there's a bunch of higher straight draws, while on Jack 8-7 there's only a few gutters you can have. So this is just way drier, and this is actually kind of wet straight board, especially if it's suited. It's one of the wettest boards in PLO. But anyway, the nothing range you see will be increasing here, although I'm sure this nothing includes, and you can actually break this nothing now by type of straight draws. Nothing might mean just like no pair, but you can certainly have a straight draw with a no pair. So I'm pretty sure, at least on this example, there's a bunch of open-endeds here. Anyway, the main difference I wanted to show here is just like sets and straights are just very common on king queen jack. The nut straight is in fact more likely than all of the sets in combined, so you definitely do not want to be overplaying your nut straight on this board. It's just very likely you're in bad shape, or doing okay versus a set and a gutter or something. And on Jack 10-7, as we move on, we see sets are much less likely, and then the straight, there's only one nut straight on both of these two examples. The straight is much less likely, again, half as likely as the nut straight on the first example. That said, I also ran this simulation to find out, because on this board there's obviously going to be a bunch of open-ended straight draws, so the people will have an open-ended or better straight draw 20% of the time, and that's going to keep this board being pretty heavy. Not as heavy as the first one probably, but it's probably going to be much lighter stack-ups in the second one, because on the first one, if you run against the very likely nuts, you're usually not in great shape, while if you run into 8-9 here with king queen 9, you're flipping, or yeah, you're probably just flipping, so that's fine. On this next example, there's no real hands like that you can have. There's no equivalent to king queen 9. People are gonna have just bare nothing more often. Sets are even less likely than in the other two examples, and straights are a bit more likely than on Jack 10-7, just because the 9-10 combo is a smaller play than the 8-9 one by a bit, I guess. But again, just the fact that there's not gonna be any open-ended straight draws, or at least to the nuts. This board is just gonna be way drier, and probably a better board to be bluff racing and yeah, semi-bluff racing, especially with topside or something like that, where you can actually stand some action. And it looks often like you shouldn't have the nuts on Jack 8-7, but it's actually more likely than the 8-9 combo here. But still, yeah, this middle board is definitely one that's gonna have heavier action, at least with a blended range or a non-polarized range, just higher straight draws and combo draws. And while on this board it's usually gonna be more a bit more polarized, a bluff racing range, because there's not enough draws to have there. Moving on to lower straight boards, the main distinction on these boards I want to talk about is just how there's a very high number of pair plus gutter type hands that are going to be in people's ranges. So a 35% range on 10-9-7 rainbow, a 35% range will flop a gutter, a third of the time. Then an open-end straight draw or better 22% of the time, and a straight 13% of the time. So 65% of the time he's gonna have at least not something like air. Obviously he can't really go wild with this, as you'll not be c-betting air that often, and you're also gonna have these straight draws and straights in your range. It just basically means you're just not able to c-bet air on these boards that often, especially in multi-way pots. Another thing I wanted to mention is these boards where the gap is on the bottom, like 10-9-7. These are the easiest to fight back with. It would be even easier on 10-9-6, where you have the double gap on the bottom. And this is simply because there's just way more higher wrap draws that are available now as we get to these lower rank boards. Also, another effect of the ranks lowering, sets and straights are gonna begin to drop in frequency, which is obviously gonna make hands like overpairs or two pairs with a draw a more important part in people's ranges to fight back with. So we're gonna compare to very different board textures. 10-9-7 is the first one, and we're gonna compare a 35% range versus a 10% range. So a 35% range, as I mentioned, is gonna have a bunch of gutters. Still, he's gonna have sets pretty rarely, and straights he's gonna have pretty often. More than twice as likely he has a straight than a set. And then obviously top pair and two pair hands and lesser pair and nothing. There are just a bunch of hands that are gonna have gutters or two pairs with them. So really pretty hard to miss this board with a 35% range. Yeah. So I have a 10% range on this board. This nothing doesn't really mean much, as now the overpair, a frequency that takes away from this nothing. We are gonna have top pair and two pair much less frequently. That's a given. Sets much less frequently, and then a straight also half as frequently as a 35% range. So seeing this, you would think that the 10-9-7 is not really a great board for us at all. That said, still 13, I guess, with the two pair hands, especially if they got like the top pair and the two pair hands, if they got a straight draw with them. Still, we're gonna hit this board pretty hard, at least 15% of the time. And then obviously some of our overpair hands are gonna have a gutter or better straight draw to go out with them. So it says here 35% of the time you'll have a bare overpair with no straight draw. That's like the worst case scenario, and I guess most of those times we're gonna have to end up check folding or just giving up on the flop. Assuming that this 10% range could be a 3-betting range. So if you don't 3-bet as many aces and kings, then and you 3-bet more rundown type hands, then obviously you're not gonna have a bare overpair as often. And even with this original range that's heavier in aces and kings, we will still have a gutter or better 55% of the time in total. So this 10-9-7 board, even though it kind of looks better for the 35% range, we can still fight back pretty easily on this board, and that's good because it obviously allows us to protect all the times we're just giving up with our bet overpair. Now this is a pretty different board. The ace 8-5-4 rainbow, much drier, and there's no really any higher reps we can have. So a 35% range is gonna still miss this board, and this nothing is just way more reasonable than the last one because there's really not many straight draws, and not straight draws aren't really worth much anyway. You can see he's just gonna have a set and straight much less often, all those really strong hands. So on this board it's not that great even for a 35% range, and you can probably c-bet with a higher frequency against a pretty straightforward opponent, and against an aggressive opponent you're probably still gonna have to check give up some of the times because he's gonna realize you probably have a 10% range didn't really connect with this board, even less often than versus a 35% range. So we can see we are gonna have a set or a straight only like 3.5% of the time. He's gonna have that hand kind of like 3 times more likely, so it's not looking good for us. Our two pairs and top pair hands also just pretty unlikely. And so in this situation 50% of the time we're gonna have a bare overpair with no straight outs, which is a pretty bad hand to have on this board, especially as against a competent opponent who will be able to read into ranges and board texture. And here we can see we'll only have a decent gutter, and by decent gutter I mean just not like an ace-3 or just like not an ace-deuce type combo, more like a 6-9 or 8-6 type gutter, only like 10% of the time with a 10% range. So it becomes really hard to fight back with on these type of boards, and you're really gonna have to be just giving up somewhat often, and then just trying and hoping that strengthens your betting range when you do bet, and you gain some fold equity when you do bet, and just kind of balance it like that. You can also mix in with some check raises and stuff like that, but it's definitely not a good board for your range. Moving on to lower straight boards. Sets and straights are gonna be even less common. On 7-6-5, like on the last board, it's gonna be tough to overcome a skilled player in position. He's gonna have a bunch of floating hands, and he's also gonna be semi-bluffing with air some percentage of the time. And you know he'll be doing that correctly, considering his range will still have a pretty good hand, 15% of the time or so. So again, we cannot seal bet mindlessly, and we have to build a check raise line or a check call check raise line in order to protect our hands with that want to get to showdown. And obviously he's not gonna have a very strong hand that often himself, especially in not this example, the last one. So a really extreme example, the 6-4 deuce rainbow, just a board where people are not gonna have sets or straights often at all. You can see here a 35% range. He's really pushing it now. If he tries to rep a really strong hand on these boards, it's not that easy. Sets are even less likely than a good combo opening the straight draw, so like a 5-7 with a pair or a 5-7-8 without this exclamation, without the actual straight. So he's gonna have that type of hand 2% of the time, so that's almost as likely as having the 3-5 combo, and more likely than having a set. And there's obviously, since he knows we're gonna have a set or straight even less of the time, there's also gonna be a bunch of even just top pair or middle pair or even bottom pair hands that he's gonna be able to semi-bluff with, just a pair with a gutter. So that's gonna turn our overpairs with a gutter or some kind of draw ourselves into a pretty powerful hand, considering he's just very rarely gonna have a really strong hand. So yeah, 10% range will definitely flop strong hands very rarely, and again, a bear overpair might be able to stamp some hero on its own, just based on the fact that the other guy shouldn't have a strong hand that often. 20% of our overpairs will have some kind of straight draw to go with them, so this is just a much better board for all overpairs in general than the 7-6-5, and a much better board for c-betting, because obviously, as opponents also know, they can't really credibly rep a strong hand on these boards. They just end up giving on the flop often, which is good news for us, obviously. So let's talk about wheel boards now, and the main reason I wanted to have this by themselves is there's just a unique characteristic in that high top set frequency, and top pair plus overcards, or 2-pair combos, while the straight is really a very low frequency, as we saw in the last example. The 3-5 and such combos are not in people's ranges as often. So aggression on these boards, even though they have straights, are just very often gonna be a set or top pair. So yeah, 35% range. It's gonna have nothing, somewhat often, and nothing and a lesser pair just really don't count for much here, unless they have an open and a straight draw like a 6-7 to go with them, or a 6-3. But yeah, top pair, 2-pair, and sets are pretty likely, almost making up for 45% or 43%, whatever. And then the straight is almost like hilariously low, the frequency. So obviously this is a deuce 3 combo, which is such a crappy hand to have in your pre-flop starting hands. It's also I chose this ace 4-5 because there's a lot of high reps, but I guess on a ace 3-5 it should be the same. It's 3 times more likely a player to have a 13 card rep like the 6-7-8 and the 3-6-7 than a straight. So yeah, it's almost 4 times more likely, which is pretty low. So in an aggressive dynamic, you can feel like in a heads-up 3-bet pot, you're actually just not folding an ace and with some overcards, obviously, against like a bet and a shove, because it's very unlikely people are going to be having straights there. Um, so yeah, during all of our examples, I didn't really mention the boards being two-tone, but I wanted to just keep it shorter because this is probably gonna be a long episode. And the key differences that apply when there's a two-tone flop is obviously the boards are gonna be heavier, even heavier in general. It's even less likely you get folds, so betting with air is definitely not going to be a great idea, especially in multi-way pots. There's a ton of new weak draws that your opponents are going to be able to flop with, and then a bunch of stronger semi-bluffing draws that people are going to be just racing you on the flop. So on 10, 6, 7, on the rainbow version, there's just not really much you can. There's not that many draws you can race with, but now you can have just like a bunch of combos of like nut or second nut flush draw with like a gutter, or a two pair with a flush draw that are basically flipping against the nut straight, so much less likely you get folds now. There's also gonna be more monsters that crush bare nut straights, like the free rolling straight, the set plus flush draw, the big combo wraps and flush draws, the top two and flush draw with higher straight draws. All of these different types of monsters that with the bare nut straight you end up having like I don't know, 30 to 25 to 35% equity on the flop. Um, so you're gonna have to, I guess, low play the bare nut straight more often and get to see a safe turn before committing some of the time because of the presence of these monsters, which is not that bad because that is gonna have the effect of keeping the nuts in our range when we just call on a drawy wet flop, which is fine because we will obviously have some just bare draws or combo draws that we don't want to stack off with. So it protects the rest of our floating range is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, with the introduction of all these combo draws, obviously draw domination becomes very important, and another key difference is straight blockers will probably lose value because people are just not stacking off with only straights anymore. So blockers just don't really block much of people's stacking range anymore. And lastly, flush draws and mixed flush draws will be included in ranges, obviously, since the board is two-tone. So when you get to the river on a rainbow board, it's very likely someone had a set or something if there was a straight on the flop, or a straight. And on these boards is just you have to include a bunch of more missed flush draws, or flush draws if the flush draw did hit. So that's it for the theory part, so let's look at some hands. Alright, so these are all gonna be 100 PLO hands from last month, I think. Anyway, really loose guy, opens under the gun, we're a bit deep with him. I decided to go ahead and 3-bet here. I don't really remember much about the session, but I was probably just targeting him, and he, as we can see, he was falling to c-bet a bunch. And if I remember correctly, he was dunking a lot. So anyway, the SPR, if he just flats, is gonna be pretty good to me as I'm in position, and this is obviously a hand I don't really want to play multi-way. So I just 3-bet and try to ISO. I don't think it's kind of iffy. Obviously I kind of hope we can, but if he was playing bad post flop, then it should be fine. Anyway, we flopped the second nut straight with king 9 on a two-tone flop. So we feel okay. If they both check, we're obviously betting, get it in against the Corsair, and probably fall into a check raise from the other guy. But we get led into, and as I said, I think he was doing this pretty often. Obviously pretty small sample, but anyway, he was being pretty aggressive on flop, and then kind of shutting down on turn a bit. So obviously I'm not gonna be folding here. Don't really need to raise though. If I do get it in against the nuts, I'm drawing pretty thin. And then of course, since the board is two-tone, there's a bunch of hands that are still like free rolling or crushing me that aren't the nut straight. So even like a king 9 with hearts, or king queen 9, or ace king queen with hearts, obviously has me in horrible shape. So I think standard just to flat here, especially against a wide betting range. I kind of do want to protect, but I don't want to, risk all my stack in a situation where I can be drawing pretty thin. So in position, I'm just flatting. Other guy calls, so probably just a two-pair type hand or flush draw. Not really important. He seems pretty bad. But then this guy pots it, so I don't know. The fact that he does pot the turn obviously worries me a lot. And this hand, I ended up folding, which I think is correct against a pot size bet on the turn from a guy that just won't play his sets, or just like his pair flush draws, or even like a flush draw with an open-ended. He might not play it this way on the turn after getting two calls. I'm gonna bring up Pro Poker Tools here and run this board against a 35% range, which, alright, so a 32% range, which is what he's opening. And we can see here, obviously, he's gonna have a set or a straight pretty often. I'll move it up a bit. He's gonna have a set or a straight pretty often. Yeah, you can go here and see just how often he's gonna have the nuts. He's actually gonna have the nut straight with ace king 20% of the time, because this is such an easy combo to have, even with me having just one king there. So you can see here a bunch of other things he's gonna have. If we click on the flush draw, then obviously he's gonna have a flush draw 25% of the time, but then combining it, a flush draw by itself he's not really gonna play it that way. He will play a set and a flush draw this way. He's also gonna have a straight and a flush draw 7% of the time, and just a straight total, 27% of the time. But I'm pretty sure he would not play 8-9 this way either. So it's probably just king nines and ace kings. And I do have an extra blocker to the king 9, and he did open under the gun obviously, so I don't know, seems pretty likely he has nuts, especially after he pots the turn, and I'm just doing pretty bad against the nuts, that I just decided to fold. And I was correct this time, and he shows up with the nuts with a flush draw. So I don't know, just a hand where we do have the second nuts and the third nuts, I guess. But obviously the nuts is such a big part of his range, especially after he bets and then pots it on the turn. And we're doing so bad against the nuts that I don't see how we can continue. It's not like when he does show up with a flush draw and a set, or a king 9 with a flush draw. It's not like we're doing that great anyway. So yeah, I think it was just a fold on the turn, and I'm glad I did it. Next hand, I opened standard on the gun, get a call by a guy that's not really that loose pre. So yeah, he's fairly often gonna hit this board, although as am I, being under the gun obviously. If we change this board quickly to Queen of Clubs, Jack of Diamonds, 9 of Diamonds, and assign myself 15% range or whatever, and himself a 20% range, then we can see that still, again, I'm gonna be flopping a set or a straight, 30% of the time. The hand that I think gets to be pretty important here is how often I have, this hand tens or kings, which, alright, I think the way to do it would be just give me 10 10 king and not king 10. Yep. Alright, so this is obviously between two players. Alright, so again, 18% chance that I'm gonna have 10-10 or king-king without having king-10, which if that's what this stands for, then that would be the result. And pretty interesting, almost as often as a straight. Like I guess I did say that in my theory videos. Anyway, I still have a pretty strong hand, you know, with top pair and an open-ended and not flush draw, so I do see bet. I think checking isn't that bad if I'm going to check raise and just commit, although I would like to be a little less deeper, I guess. And I don't know, I just think it obviously means my range is gonna be more not heavy than just by c-betting here, although I'm definitely not c-betting light in a three-way pot. So he calls. Being that I have two tens and the not flush draw, I think his range is very heavily weighted towards a set. So I am gonna try to get him off that and build a pot in case I hit. So I bet the turn, assuming he just won't shove. He can obviously have king 10 or 10-8 sometimes here, but obviously I have two tens, and I think with any king 10 with or without a flush draw, he would probably just shove the turn, not wanting to get outdrawn, and he's doing much better now against my like two pair with flush draw type hands. So the river's a 3, and I guess his flop calling range also has a bunch of like queen 9-10, queen jack 10 type hands, maybe some king queen 9, king jack 9 type hands. So yeah, I think barreling the turn is pretty standard. Barreling the river, now that he calls his turn, I think he folds most of those on the turn, honestly. I don't think he folds as said, obviously, but he should fold like a bunch of his two pair combos after I bet, especially because I bet on the bigger side, although it's kind of standard for this board texture. So anyway, I don't know, a river bet only needs to work like 50% of the time or a bit lower than that, because it's just under one pot size bet, and obviously I don't think I have any showdown value with my top pair, so I just get it in, and he does call with middle set, which I think is fine. It's kind of weird that he didn't jam the flop with a set and a flush draw, being that he's in pretty good shape against a set. I don't know, he probably was just expecting me to, I don't know if he was expecting me to barrel, and it worked out great for him, although I'm not necessarily using my 10 blockers here, and in fact I'm pretty sure I'm not gonna be using my 10s as a blocker, as just a barreling here, unless I have something to go with it. And the kings, I might also not be as excited in a three-way pot out of position, unless I have like diamond or something. So I don't know, I guess it was a fine call by him. It was a good call by him, especially because he only needs to be correct 33% of the time or whatever. And my shove after he calls a turn, you know, if he's not folding sets, obviously it's not great, but obviously I'm still gonna have the nuts at least as often as I'm gonna have kings or tens without the nut straight, and I'm definitely not gonna be using all my kings and tens to barrel off here because of the flush draw on the flop. If it's a rainbow flop, I'm much more likely to do so, I guess. And yeah, he might have called also because of the missed flush draw. I don't know if he thinks I'm gonna be barreling off with just like ace queen and king queen with diamonds, but we probably also has some dynamic where I had barreled off before, so maybe it wasn't that great. Alright, so next hand I open MP and bottom calls. He has a 35% range and this board, so I think just c-betting is fine. Not sure why I decided to do otherwise. I guess I just wanted to maybe balance my range a bit here and go for a check raise. This is, pretty decent hand to go for a check raise actually. We do have a bunch of equity against the nuts, and if he's stabbing white here, as he might be doing, just because we're not gonna hit this flop, or we might hit this flop but not with the hand we necessarily want to be building a pot with our position. And we don't really expect that much fold equity on this board texture, so mixing in check raises here is fine, and this is one of the better hands to do it with, I guess. Once he calls, I guess he has some straights in his range and a bunch of sets in his range as well. So yeah, on that card, I don't think barreling is gonna be that great. I could bet just like $20, but I'm definitely not like, if I check raise straight, I would probably just be check folding here, and I think it's gonna be fine to do so with this hand anyway, just because his range is pretty two pair and set heavy after he just flats the flop there. And if he does have a straight, he probably just check back himself on the turn, and I might be able to improve on the river anyway. So yeah, I just check and he pots it, so I guess I have to fold. Just wanted to point out a way to play it on the flop, I guess. Against an opponent that's not really betting that much when check 2, and he's more the kind that's gonna be raising our c-bets on these type of boards with like 10s or queens or just some random air, then it would be a much better hand to just come out c-betting and expecting to get raised sometimes, and then go shove over the top. Or it can also be a hand we can use to just c-bet, and against a floater then check raise the turn if he bets the turn with a wide range and floats the flop with a wide range. So it depends, but it's just a good hand on this board. You can use different ways. Kind of a loose open under the gun, not being suited to the jack. Not sure I like it. Doesn't seem like a great table or anything, so probably not a great idea. I do get called by a really tight guy, really tight aggressive opponent that c-bets a lot, and if I remember correctly, bets when check 2 in position a lot. So we get one of these low straight boards where it's just really uncommon for both of us, me being on the gun and him, playing such a tight range, to have a straight or strong enough hand here. So even the fact that it's two-tone, he's not necessarily gonna be stacking off with any flush draw, and I have the nut blocker. So like in last hand, this is a board where I'm actually probably gonna be c-betting fairly often. This guy does fold to c-bet. He's usually multi-taping a lot, so he does fold to c-bet a lot, but he's also not that bad. He does get creative and might float or bluff raise here. So I just tried to do what I did in last hand, and as I said, on these two-tone boards, blockers aren't really that useful, but I think the nut flush blocker in this situation is actually pretty useful. It just takes away so many of the combos he's actually happy to shove on the flop. So I do check raise. This is also just a fine hand to bet, but as I said, if he's gonna be floating or raising the flop, it's not like I'm gonna be wanting to 3-bet with these stack sizes on the flop, which is like a bare nut blocker. So even though it's more expensive for me to check raise than to c-bet, and it has to work more often, I do collect obviously his dead money in the pot, and assuming he is betting with a wide range and not hitting this board hard often, there's just not many hands he's gonna be able to fight back with when he doesn't have the nut flush draw here. So that did not work, and I don't know, I think I just ran into the top of his range. Obviously he's not like shoving a bear over pair here or anything, so I think I got somewhat unlucky there, but I don't think it's such a bad play at all. And the other thing is, he already seen me check raise here, so even though I ended up folding, obviously to his jam, the mere fact that I'm able to raise under the gun and check raise on a board like this might make him less likely to just bet with, his whole range when I check in this situation. So it's not that important that the check raise didn't work. It's just like the threat of the check raise is gonna be powerful enough to deter him from betting a very wide range, which is great when you're out of position. Standard ISO raise, get a decent flop, and this guy pots it into me. So I don't know, he seems kind of not really that aggressive. Dunk bets 17% through 28 hands, which is kind of high. So I don't know, I guess on this board texture, I do remember this hand. I ended just shoving because of the 5 blocker and the nut flusher. I can't really be in bad shape, and I just thought he might have been taking a stab on this straight board. So yeah, I don't necessarily remember why I chose this hand, but I do remember him stacking off pretty bad here. He actually just calls and then check calls all in on the turn. And he's drawing pretty thin. Obviously, it's pretty bad play by him. So let's talk about that. On the flop, he's leading. His lead is obviously not great, unless he's just planning on, with a bear open-ended on a two-tone board. His hand just loses a ton of value. If he was just stabbing in order for me to fold, like a bear over pair type hand, that's fine. But obviously, when I raise, I'm not gonna have that many 4/5s in my range. Which he's not doing that bad against, I guess, but I am gonna have a bunch of higher flush draws in my range, and that's the type of hand that he's just getting crushed by. So obviously an opponent that's not really reading into ranges, both pre-flop and post-flop, and he just was drawing, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. I think a better strategy in his situation, if you ever get somehow into this situation, would be just to check call flop, obviously maintain your not outs, and then you can also just semi bluff the hearts when they come, because you do have the queen of hearts blocker, and it makes sense for a check calling range to have a flush draw with it very often, and actually probably more so than straight draws on this board. The other thing is, on this board texture, this is, I guess, one of the worst ones to have a straight on, at least this type of structure where you have just the bottom end of the straight with 4/5, and then like half the deck is bad for you on both the turn and the river. So that's a thing I forgot to mention on the what makes a difference on suited boards is how the turn and river distribution is gonna be like, and it's usually just way worse for the very straight draws. And there's also, for the same reason, a bunch of times where even if you have 4/5 here and in his position and you bet and get raise and a shove, then you should be able to just fold that hand, because it's gonna be doing pretty bad in a three-way pot just because of the flush draw and the specific texture where there's a bunch of higher reps available for your opponents. Alright, so yeah, it's kind of funny how even if he had 4/5, like if we were deeper, he wouldn't be able to check raise this flop. I mean, it wouldn't be a great hand to check raise this flop, just because of how many draws there are. I'm gonna be able to call in position if we were deeper, and just there's gonna be, he's gonna have to fade out half of the deck. And the big problem with straights is that when a flush or a board pair comes, like, they're drawing dead against the value part of your range, and they probably don't have a huge equity advantage against even your semi-bluffing hands on those turns. So yeah, it usually just gonna make sense for them to just check fold the turn instead of like check call and try to then check call or I guess right on the river again. So yeah, be careful on with bearish trades on these board textures. And I win. Alright, so next hand, again sort of wide opener on the gun. I guess flattening isn't that bad, but I don't know, I decided to 3-bet here. And again, we flew up second nuts. We do have 2 pair now, which is much better, and we do have a backdoor flush draw. It's not great because obviously he will have the nut straight or pretty often here as well after raising another gun. So I just bet a standard amount. I think I do have to fold to a check raise just on account of I'm also gonna have a bunch of straights here and he's just not gonna be able to check raise, and I have blockers to top and middle set, so he's not gonna be check raising with sets as often. So anyway, he just check calls. Since this is a 3-bet pot by the turn, you know, on this card I just have to barrel, I think. He might be slow playing the king queen, specifically because it's a rainbow board, but he's also just check calling with a bunch of 2 pairs, maybe some sets, or although not many because of the blockers, and of course a bunch of like open-ended like queen jacks, queen tens, queen nines, all of those hands. I don't expect him to just check fold on the flop. So yeah, with the 2 pair and the picked up flush draw, I feel fine about just stacking off here. I think I bet a little bit too big. It's not really much reason to bet as big. I'm still stacking off no matter what, just because of the flush draw and 2 pair. Yeah, because I only need 20% here. So yeah, I do call, and I guess this was just a situation where, you know, we did have the second nuts again, but with all this backup equity and the fact that we were shorter and he wasn't taking the initiative, potted into me or whatever, then it's a hand where we can basically treat it as the nuts on the turn, and we actually got it in good. His hand is actually pretty interesting on the flop. I think he should maybe consider just leading out and then fold into further action, although he's obviously allowing me to play a big pot whenever I want. But then again, like if he checks, he just loses control of the pot, and he still has to, I guess, check call once. But he should be able to fold a turn, I think, just because it's just so often I'm gonna have the nut straight or second nut straight here, and I'm just not barreling that light against the check calling range on the flop. That obviously includes pretty strong hands after raising under the gun. So yeah, I think he might have overplayed his hand there a bit, although it's certainly uncomfortable against an aggressive barreler. That's, you know, barreling with kings and queens, although worth considering I'm not 3-betting that many kings and queens in this position, so they're probably gonna be really good queens and kings that are still gonna have straights very often. So yeah, anyway, I think he should just check fold the turn, although it's very, very uncomfortable to do so. So yeah, this will just be the last hand. This is a spot where I 3-bet and get 2 calls, and I think on this board texture, you know, I could give up in a 3-bet pot, but I think here I just decided to c-bet half the pot. Obviously it just doesn't really have to work very often at all, and this sharp nut guy especially is in a really tough spot, with just most of his range that didn't hit this board, and Moxie probably doesn't really expect me to fold after betting this small and betting into 2 players. So I guess it basically becomes kind of a math thing, and how often they are gonna actually hit this board, although I do accept that they're gonna be stacking off pretty wide there. So I don't know, I'm just gonna give myself my hand and then two 35% ranges and run the interactive hand stats, which is awesome. So yeah, I guess we'll just analyze it for one of them because it should be fairly similar. So yeah, nothing, or I guess close to nothing, just 20% of the time. A set and a straight pretty not often, and you know, a bare over pair that doesn't really count for much here unless it has a gutter. So yeah, even gutter type hands like bare 7-8 aren't really great here in both of these guys' situations, unless they have something else to go with them. So I don't know, maybe we can look at some straight outs. They will have an open-ended, so it's usually going to be like a 6-5 or a 4-5 or 3-5 type hand 13% of the time. So yeah, I guess oh yeah, this is good. So 52% of the time they're not going to have any straight outs. So yeah, I think it's a decent spot to just, with these stack sizes, maybe betting is fine here, especially such a small amount, and you really handcuff them on this board texture into playing pretty straightforwardly. And being as they're not going to have that much to fight back with, so yeah, I think it's fine. All right. So that's basically it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to post any comments in the DC thread. This is Orsto for thestrat.com.